Around 3200 BC, in the fertile marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates River created a network of channels and tributaries, the city of Uruk emerged as the first true metropolis in human history. Covering nearly 1,000 acres at its peak and housing an estimated 50,000 inhabitants, Uruk represented a revolutionary transformation in human social organization that marked the transition from scattered agricultural settlements to complex urban civilization. Archaeological excavations conducted by the German Oriental Society beginning in 1913 have revealed 18 distinct occupation layers spanning over 4,000 years of continuous habitation, with the deepest levels exposing the foundations of humanity's first experiment in city living. The scale and sophistication of early Uruk defies conventional assumptions about gradual urban development. Unlike later cities that evolved slowly from smaller settlements, Uruk appears in the archaeological record as a fully realized urban center, complete with monumental architecture, specialized craft production, complex administrative systems, and social hierarchies that required unprecedented levels of organization and coordination. The Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Eanna, contained temple complexes covering over 100,000 square meters, constructed with millions of mud bricks produced by organized labor forces numbering in the thousands. The city's emergence coincides with revolutionary innovations in human technology and culture, including the invention of writing, the development of the potter's wheel, advances in metallurgy, and the establishment of long-distance trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with regions as distant as Afghanistan and the Mediterranean coast. Sumerian tradition recorded in later king lists and literary texts attributes Uruk's founding to divine intervention, with the city serving as the earthly seat of the ski god Anu and his daughter Eanna. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BC but drawing from much earlier sources, identifies Uruk as the first city to receive kingship after the Great Flood, with the semi-mythical king Enmerkar credited as the city's founder and first great builder. Archaeological evidence reveals that the site was occupied as early as 5500 BC during the Ubaid period, but the transformation into a true city occurred during the Uruk period, beginning around 4100 BC, when population concentrations and monumental construction projects indicate the emergence of centralized political authority. The mythology surrounding Uruk's foundation appears in multiple Sumerian literary compositions that present the city as uniquely chosen by the gods to serve as the center of divine human interaction on Earth. The composition known as Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period but describing events supposedly occurring around 30,000 BC, portrays Enmerkar as a king of such wisdom and piety that the goddess Eanna herself descended from heaven to dwell in Uruk and ensure the city's prosperity. The text describes how Enmerkar constructed the first great temple to Eanna and established the rituals and offerings that would maintain divine favor for generations. While modern scholarship recognizes these narratives as legendary rather than historical, the texts preserve genuine cultural memories of Uruk's emergence as Mesopotamia's first dominant urban center. The Sumerian king list presents Uruk's royal dynasty in terms that blur the boundaries between myth and history. The list credits the first king of Uruk after the flood, Meskiagasha, with a reign of 324 years, while his son Enmerkar supposedly ruled for 420 years. These impossibly long reigns gradually decrease in later entries until reaching more historically plausible durations for kings who can be corroborated through contemporary inscriptions and archaeological evidence. The pattern suggests the list preserves dim memories of actual rulers whose reigns have been extended through legendary accretion and the compression of multiple generations into single royal names. Archaeological investigation provides a more prosaic but equally fascinating account of Uruk's origins. Excavations directed by Julius Jordan and later Arnold Noldeck between 1912 and 1939 revealed continuous occupation at the site extending back to the Ubaid period around 5500 BC. During these early phases, the settlement consisted of scattered agricultural villages practicing irrigation farming and raising domesticated animals. The population lived in simple reed and mud structures similar to those still used by marsh dwellers in southern Iraq, supporting themselves through cultivation of barley and dates supplemented by fish and waterfowl from the extensive wetlands. The dramatic transformation began around 4100 BC, during what archaeologists term the early Uruk period, when the settlement's population began expanding rapidly and the first monumental architecture appeared. This phase saw the construction of substantial temple platforms and the emergence of craft specialization with dedicated workshops for pottery production, textile manufacturing, and metallurgy. The driving forces behind this urban revolution remain debated among scholars, with theories emphasizing factors including agricultural intensification through improved irrigation technology, the organizational demands of managing flood control systems, the concentration of religious authority in temple institutions, and the competitive dynamics between emerging elites seeking to demonstrate power through monumental construction. The Middle Uruk period from 3800 to 3400 BC witnessed acceleration of urban growth, with the population reaching perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, concentrated in an area of approximately 250 hectares. During this phase, the Eanna precinct emerged as the city's ceremonial and administrative centre, with massive building projects requiring coordination of thousands of labourers working under centralised direction. The scale of construction activities necessitated new forms of social organisation, including specialised administrators, craft workers, and labourers who received rations from temple storehouses rather than supporting themselves through direct agricultural production. By the late Uruk period from 3400 to 3100 BC, the city had reached its maximum extent of approximately 550 hectares, with an estimated population of 50,000, making it by far the largest settlement anywhere in the world. No contemporary city approached Uruk in size or organisational complexity. With most human populations still living in small agricultural villages, rarely exceeding a few hundred inhabitants. The achievement of urban living on this unprecedented scale required revolutionary innovations in technology, administration, and social organisation that would establish patterns persisting throughout Mesopotamian history. The legendary kings of early Uruk, including Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, Dumuzid, and Gilgamesh, became the subjects of extensive literary traditions composed centuries after their supposed reigns. These narratives present the kings as heroic figures, performing impossible deeds, including journeys to distant lands, battles with monsters, and intimate interactions with gods and goddesses. While the historical reality behind these legends remains uncertain, the persistence of the traditions suggests they commemorate actual rulers whose accomplishments were magnified through oral transmission into the epic narratives preserved in later written versions. The Eanna sacred precinct formed the religious and administrative heart of early Uruk, covering an area of 9 hectares dominated by massive temple platforms and ceremonial buildings dedicated to Eanna, the goddess of love, war, and political power. Excavations in the deepest levels of Eanna uncovered the remains of the stone-cone temple, constructed around 3400 BC, whose walls were decorated with tens of thousands of clay cones, arranged in geometric patterns and painted in red, black and white to create elaborate mosaics, visible from great distances across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The architectural development of the Eanna precinct demonstrates the increasing organisational capacity of Uruk's ruling institutions across several centuries. The earliest substantial structures, dating to Eanna 14 around 3800 BC, consisted of relatively modest temple buildings constructed on low platforms using standard mud brick. Each successive building phase involved demolition of earlier structures and construction of larger, more elaborate replacements on platforms raised to progressively greater heights. By Eanna IV, around 3200 BC, the precinct contained multiple temple complexes including buildings measuring over 70 metres in length, with elaborate internal divisions creating dozens of rooms serving various ceremonial and administrative functions. The stone-cone temple exemplifies the innovative architectural techniques developed during the Middle Uruk period. German archaeologists working under the direction of Julius Jordan between 1928 and 1932 exposed substantial portions of this building's foundations and lower walls. The structure measured approximately 30 metres by 20 metres, with walls nearly 5 metres thick at the base to support an upper story, whose precise form remains uncertain due to poor preservation. The most distinctive feature involved the insertion of thousands of coloured clay cones into the mud brick walls while the mortar remained wet, with the flat ends of the cones forming the exterior surface, while the pointed ends were embedded deep in the wall fabric. The geometric patterns created by these cone mosaics included vertical columns, horizontal stripes, zigzag designs, and complex interlocking patterns that would have created striking visual effects. Chemical analysis of the cone pigments reveals sophisticated ceramic technology involving controlled firing temperatures and the addition of mineral compounds to produce stable colours resistant to fading. Red pigments derived from iron oxide compounds, black from manganese oxides, and white from kaolin clays or lime-based materials. The production of tens of thousands of identical cones required standardized manufacturing using molds and specialized workers devoted exclusively to this task. Archaeological investigation reveals that the Eanna precinct served multiple overlapping functions combining religious, administrative, and economic activities in ways that make rigid functional distinctions problematic. The temples certainly housed the cult statues of Eanna and other deities, with priests performing daily rituals involving offerings of food, drink, and incense to maintain divine favor. Simultaneously, the complex served as the administrative center for vast agricultural estates owned by the temple, with scribes recording receipts of grain, livestock, and other products, tracking distributions of rations to workers, and maintaining accounts of trade transactions. Storage facilities within the Eanna precinct could accommodate enormous quantities of agricultural produce collected as temple revenues. Excavation of storage buildings from Eanna 3 revealed rooms containing hundreds of large storage jars with capacities of 100 to 200 litres each, providing total storage volumes measured in thousands of cubic metres. These facilities held barley and wheat collected as tithes and rents from temple lands, dates from temple palm groves, wool from temple flocks, and manufactured goods produced in temple workshops. The concentration of such wealth made the temple both an economic powerhouse and an attractive target for rivals seeking to control Uruk's resources. The administrative texts from Eanna provide glimpses of the complex bureaucratic systems required to manage temple operations. The earliest tablets record distributions of rations to workers identified by professional titles, including ploughmen, shepherds, fishermen, brewers, bakers, and craftspeople of various specializations. Other texts track assignments of land to dependent laborers, receipts of tribute from outlying villages, and allocations of raw materials to workshops for manufacturing activities. The precision and standardization of these records demonstrate sophisticated accounting procedures and the existence of trained administrators capable of maintaining complex systems of documentation. The world's oldest known writing system emerged in Uruk around 3200 BC in response to the administrative challenges of managing temple economies involving thousands of workers, complex agricultural production, and extensive trade networks. The earliest texts, discovered in the Eanna precinct and catalogued as the Uruk 4 tablets, consist of approximately 5,000 clay documents recording economic transactions using a pictographic script that combined ideographic symbols representing objects and concepts with numerical notation systems for counting and measuring. The invention of writing represents one of humanity's most significant technological achievements, fundamentally transforming the capacity for storing and transmitting information across time and space. Before writing, human knowledge existed only in individual memories and oral traditions, limiting the complexity of information that could be reliably preserved and communicated. Writing enabled the creation of permanent records that could document transactions, preserve legal agreements, transmit instructions across distances, and accumulate knowledge across generations. The immediate stimulus for developing writing appears to have been the bookkeeping requirements of Uruk's temple institutions. As these organizations grew larger and their economic activities became more complex, the earlier system of using clay tokens to track transactions became increasingly inadequate. Small clay objects shaped to represent different commodities had been used throughout the Near East since at least 7500 BC, with different token shapes indicating sheep, grain, oil, and other products. Complex transactions might involve dozens of tokens kept together in clay envelopes, but this system became unwieldy for institutions managing thousands of individual transactions. The crucial innovation involved impressing the tokens onto the surfaces of clay tablets before enclosing them in envelopes, creating permanent records of the enclosed tokens visible on the envelope's exterior. This practice led to the realization that the impressions themselves could serve as records, making the actual tokens redundant. Over several generations, the impressed symbols evolved into drawn pictographs, representing not just concrete objects, but also abstract concepts, numerical quantities, and eventually phonetic values that could represent the sounds of spoken language. The Uruk 4 tablets discovered in the deepest occupation levels of the Eanna precinct represent the earliest phase of this writing system. These documents, excavated by German archaeologists between 1929 and 1939, and subsequently published in comprehensive editions by Adam Falkenstein and other scholars, employ approximately 1,200 distinct pictographic signs. Many signs clearly depict the objects they represent, including human figures, animals, plants, tools, and containers. Others represent abstract concepts through symbolic associations, such as a star sign indicating heaven or divinity, or a foot sign representing walking or movement. The numerical systems employed in these earliest texts demonstrate sophisticated mathematical concepts. Separate notation systems existed for counting discrete objects like sheep or jars, measuring capacity for grain and liquids, and calculating areas of land. The sexagesimal base 60 system that would characterize Mesopotamian mathematics throughout later periods already appears in these texts, indicating that this mathematical innovation predates the invention of writing itself and may derive from earlier traditions of astronomical observation and calendrical calculation. Analysis of the Uruk 4 tablets reveals they document primarily economic transactions involving the receipt, storage, and distribution of goods. A typical tablet might record that a particular official received a specified quantity of barley from a named individual and distributed portions to several workers identified by their professional titles. Other tablets track livestock herds, allocations of land to workers, assignments of rations, and distributions of manufactured goods. The consistently economic focus of these earliest texts confirms that writing emerged as a tool for institutional administration rather than for recording religious texts, royal propaganda, or literary compositions. The social implications of literacy in early Uruk were profound. The ability to read and write became a specialized skill, requiring years of training, creating a new professional class of scribes who occupied privileged positions in the administrative hierarchy. These literate specialists served as essential intermediaries between illiterate workers and managers, recording transactions, maintaining archives, and retrieving information as needed. The power derived from controlling written information contributed to the development of more complex social hierarchies and the increasing centralization of authority in temple and palace institutions. Rising 17 meters above the surrounding plain on an artificial platform constructed from millions of mud bricks, the White Temple represented one of Uruk's most impressive architectural achievements. Built around 3200 BC and dedicated to the ski god Anu, the temple measured 22 meters by 17 meters, with walls covered in white gypsum plaster that reflected sunlight and made the structure visible for kilometers across the flat landscape, serving as a powerful symbol of divine presence and political authority. The construction of the White Temple and its supporting platform required mobilization of labor forces and resources on a scale unprecedented in human history. Modern calculations estimate that the platform alone contains approximately 200,000 cubic meters of compacted earth and mud bricks, representing millions of individual bricks each weighing several kilograms. The production of this quantity of bricks required substantial clay sources, access to water for mixing, fuel for firing kilns or drying in the sun, and thousands of workers laboring for months or years to complete the project. The platform was constructed using a technique of layered horizontal beds of mud brick alternating with compacted earthfill, creating a stable foundation capable of supporting the temple's weight while minimizing settling that could crack walls and floors. Drainage systems incorporated into the platform included channels and weep holes that prevented water accumulation within the structure, protecting against erosion and collapse. The outer faces of the platform were protected by thick retaining walls of mud brick, with the visible surfaces finished in white plaster matching the temple itself. The White Temple that crowned this platform exemplifies the architectural principles that would characterize Mesopotamian religious architecture for millennia. The building's plan consists of a central rectangular chamber oriented along a northwest-southeast axis, surrounded by smaller rooms and corridors providing access and service space. The main chamber measured approximately 16 meters long by 4 meters wide, with a raised platform or altar at one end that presumably supported the cult statue of Anu. Worshippers entered through a doorway in the long wall rather than at the ends, an arrangement that created indirect sightlines, preventing casual viewers from glimpsing the deity's image. The temple's walls were constructed using standard mud bricks measuring approximately 40 centimeters by 20 centimeters by 10 centimeters, laid in courses with mud mortar binding the bricks together. The exterior surfaces were covered with white gypsum plaster several centimeters thick, requiring extensive deposits of gypsum that had to be quarried, crushed, heated to drive off water, and mixed with water to create workable plaster. The brilliant white finish served multiple purposes, including protection of the mud brick from water damage, creation of smooth surfaces for decorative painting or relief sculpture, and symbolic associations with purity and divine radiance. Archaeological investigation by German teams led by Julius Jordan in the 1920s revealed that the White Temple represented only the final phase in a sequence of rebuildings on the same site. Earlier temple structures buried beneath the platform showed similar orientations and plans, indicating continuity of religious practice across multiple building phases. Each reconstruction involved ritual demolition of the earlier temple, careful burial of the remains, and construction of a larger replacement on a higher platform, creating the accumulated height of the final complex. The religious significance of the White Temple extended beyond its function as a house for Anu's cult statue. The elevated position made the temple a liminal space mediating between earth and heaven, with priests ascending ramps or stairways to reach the divine realm. The visibility of the White Temple across the flat landscape made it a constant reminder of divine oversight and the power of the institutions controlling access to the gods. Pilgrims travelling to Uruk would have seen the gleaming white structure long before reaching the city itself, creating anticipation and reinforcing the city's sacred character. Archaeological surveys using magnetometry and excavation trenches reveal that Uruk was laid out according to a systematic urban plan dividing the city into distinct residential, commercial, religious and industrial districts connected by a network of streets and canals. The main thoroughfares, some measuring up to 10 meters wide, were surfaced with packed earth and gravel to facilitate the movement of goods and people, while narrower lanes provided access to residential neighborhoods organized into housing blocks that accommodated families of different social classes. The application of geophysical survey techniques to the Uruk site beginning in the 1990s has revolutionized understanding of the city's overall layout and organization. Magnetometry surveys conducted by teams from the German Archaeological Institute detected buried walls, streets, and structures across large areas without requiring excavation, revealing patterns of urban organization invisible in limited excavation trenches. These surveys demonstrate that far from developing organically through random accretion of buildings, early Uruk was shaped by deliberate planning that created regularized street grids and designated zones for different activities. The primary north-south and east-west avenues that structured the city measured between 8 and 12 meters wide, substantially broader than necessary for pedestrian traffic alone. These wide thoroughfares accommodated the movement of donkey caravans bringing goods from the countryside and trading centres, ceremonial processions involving hundreds or thousands of participants, and the general circulation of people and goods in a city of 50,000 inhabitants. The surfaces were maintained by municipal authorities who organised periodic resurfacing with gravel and packed earth to prevent the formation of deep ruts and mud during seasonal rains. Secondary streets measuring 4 to 6 meters wide connected the main avenues and provided access to residential neighborhoods. These streets followed relatively straight alignments, creating a rough grid pattern, though perfect regularity was impossible, given the need to accommodate existing buildings, temples, canals, and topographic features. The street network created housing blocks measuring approximately 50 to 100 meters on each side, within which individual houses were packed relatively densely with shared walls between adjacent properties. The narrowest lanes, measuring only 1 to 2 meters wide, penetrated into the interiors of housing blocks, providing access to houses that did not front directly on major streets. These passages were too narrow for wheeled vehicles and barely accommodated 2 people passing, but they allowed residents to reach their homes without traversing neighbours' properties. The narrowness also provided shade during the intense summer heat, and created semi-private zones where neighbours could socialise away from the busier thoroughfares. The canal system that supplemented the street network served multiple essential functions, including water supply, irrigation of urban gardens, transportation of bulk goods, and drainage of stormwater and sewage. The primary canal entering from the Euphrates River measured approximately 15 metres wide and flowed through the city along an alignment parallel to the main north-south avenue. Secondary canals branched off at regular intervals to distribute water throughout different city districts, with smaller channels providing access to individual neighbourhoods and properties. The engineering challenges of maintaining a functional canal system in an urban environment required sophisticated technical knowledge and substantial ongoing maintenance. Canals had to maintain gentle gradients to ensure water flow without creating erosion, while avoiding accumulation of sediment that would clog channels. Regular dredging removed accumulated silt, with the excavated material used for brickmaking or construction fill. Control gates and distribution basins regulated water flow to different districts, with officials responsible for ensuring equitable access and preventing conflicts over water allocation. The division of Uruk into distinct functional zones reflected both practical necessities and social hierarchies. The Eanna and Anu precincts occupied the city's ceremonial core, with these sacred areas surrounded by elite residential neighbourhoods where wealthy families built substantial houses around interior courtyards. Craft manufacturing districts clustered near the city walls, where pottery kilns, metalworking furnaces and textile workshops could operate without disturbing residential areas with smoke, noise and industrial waste. The poorest inhabitants occupied crowded neighbourhoods in less desirable locations near industrial zones or on the city's periphery. Later Sumerian tradition attributed the construction of Uruk's massive defensive walls to the legendary king Gilgamesh, who ruled around 2700 BC. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes these fortifications with specific details that archaeological investigation has confirmed, stating the walls measured 9 kilometres in circumference, stood as high as a 2-storey building, and were thick enough that chariot teams could race along their tops. Excavations conducted by the German expedition trace substantial portions of these walls, constructed from millions of fired bricks. The epic poem opens with a description of Uruk's walls that serves as proof of Gilgamesh's greatness and lasting legacy. The text instructs the reader to climb upon the wall of Uruk and walk around its perimeter, examining the foundation terrace and inspecting the brickwork to see that its bricks were fired in kilns rather than merely sun-dried. This emphasis on fired brick construction represents a significant technical achievement, as the production of kiln-fired bricks required substantially more fuel and labour than sun-dried bricks, but created more durable materials capable of withstanding erosion and structural stresses for centuries. Archaeological investigation has confirmed many details of the epic's description, while revealing the complexity of Uruk's defensive systems. The German expedition led by Arnold Noldeck in the 1930s traced the wall circuit for substantial distances, documenting construction techniques and phases of rebuilding that spanned several centuries. The earliest defensive walls dating to the early dynastic period around 2900 BC consisted of relatively modest structures built primarily from sun-dried mud brick. The massive fortifications described in the Gilgamesh epic represent later reconstructions undertaken during the early dynastic III period around 2600 BC, when Uruk faced increasing military threats from rival city-states. The dimensions recorded by German archaeologists closely match the epic's descriptions. The wall circuit measured approximately 9.5 kilometres in total length, enclosing an area of roughly 550 hectares that included not only the densely built urban core but also extensive gardens, orchards, and open spaces that could support the population during sieges. The walls themselves varied in thickness from 8 to 16 metres, depending on location and building phase, with the wider sections indeed capable of accommodating chariot traffic along their tops as described in ancient texts. The height of the walls reached approximately 9 to 12 metres above ground level, based on analysis of surviving foundations and comparison with later Mesopotamian fortification systems. This substantial elevation required sophisticated engineering to prevent collapse under the weight of the structure and to resist undermining by attackers. The builders employed techniques including stepped foundations that distributed weight over larger areas, regular buttresses projecting from the wall faces to provide lateral stability, and internal chambers within the wall thickness that reduced weight while maintaining structural integrity. The construction materials represented a massive investment of resources and labour. Chemical analysis of brick samples reveals that the fired bricks were produced using clay from sources several kilometres from Uruk, requiring transportation of raw materials before manufacturing could begin. Modern estimates suggest the complete wall circuit contained approximately 15 million individual bricks, each weighing between 5 and 7 kilograms, representing a total weight of over 75,000 tons of fired clay. The fuel requirements for firing this quantity of bricks would have consumed vast quantities of wood or reeds, necessitating systematic exploitation of forest resources or cultivation of fuel crops. The defensive system incorporated additional features beyond the basic wall structure. Archaeological evidence reveals the existence of massive gates at intervals along the circuit where major roads entered the city. These gates consisted of recessed entryways flanked by projecting towers that allowed defenders to direct projectiles at attackers attempting to force entry. The gate passages were designed to be blocked by heavy wooden doors reinforced with metal fittings, with provision for drop bars that could secure the doors against battering rams. During peacetime, these gates served as control points where authorities could monitor traffic, collect tolls, and inspect goods entering the city. A substantial moat or defensive canal ran parallel to the wall circuit on the exterior side, creating an additional obstacle for attackers. This feature appears in texts describing Uruk's defences and has been confirmed through excavation at several points along the wall line. The moat measured approximately 10 to 15 metres wide and 3 to 4 metres deep, filled with water diverted from the city's canal system. The combination of water barrier and high wall created formidable defensive obstacles that would have required sophisticated siege equipment to overcome. The strategic implications of Uruk's massive fortifications extended beyond simple military defence. The walls served as powerful symbols of the city's strength and the organisational capacity of its rulers. The ability to mobilise the labour forces and resources necessary to construct such massive works demonstrated political authority and economic power that reinforced the ruling elite's legitimacy. The walls also defined the boundaries of civilised urban space, marking the transition from the ordered world of the city to the uncertain dangers of the surrounding countryside. Excavations in residential areas reveal that Uruk's population lived in multi-room houses constructed from mud brick around central courtyards that provided light, ventilation and workspace for domestic activities. The typical urban dwelling measured between 60 and 100 square metres, with separate areas for sleeping, cooking, storage and specialised craft production, indicating that many households engaged in textile weaving, pottery production, or other manufacturing activities that supplemented agricultural income. The archaeological investigation of residential neighbourhoods presents significant challenges due to the difficulty of excavating domestic structures buried beneath metres of accumulated debris and later construction. The most extensive residential excavations at Uruk were conducted by German teams in areas designated as squares K13 and L13 during the 1960s and 70s. These excavations exposed portions of housing blocks from various periods, revealing patterns of domestic architecture and providing insights into daily life for ordinary urban inhabitants. The standard house plan consisted of rooms arranged around a central courtyard that served as the heart of domestic life. This courtyard, typically measuring between 15 and 30 square metres, remained open to the sky and provided the primary source of light and ventilation for surrounding rooms. The courtyard surfaces were paved with baked brick or covered with packed earth, and sometimes included shallow basins or drains for collecting rainwater or disposing of wash water from domestic activities. During the hot summer months, families conducted most daily activities in the courtyard, including food preparation, craft production, and social gatherings, retreating to roofed rooms only during the intense midday heat or for sleeping. The rooms surrounding the courtyard served various specialised functions determined by their size, location, and internal features. The largest room, typically positioned on the side of the courtyard offering the most shade, served as the main living and sleeping area for the family. This room measured between 20 and 40 square metres and contained built-in features including raised platforms that served as beds or seating areas, storage niches built into walls, and sometimes brick installations that may have supported wooden furniture or served ritual functions. The floors were surfaced with packed earth or mud plaster that required periodic renewal to maintain clean surfaces. Kitchen areas occupied smaller rooms or sections of the courtyard equipped with installations for food preparation and cooking. The primary cooking facility consisted of a cylindrical mud brick oven called a tanna, approximately 50 to 80 centimetres in diameter and 1 metre tall, with an opening at the base for inserting fuel and a top opening for placing bread dough against the interior walls or setting cooking pots. These ovens required regular maintenance, including replastering interior surfaces damaged by heat and replacing fuel grates that burned away over time. Additional food preparation areas included grinding stones for processing grain into flour, stone mortars for crushing spices and other ingredients, and work surfaces for kneading dough and preparing meals. Storage rooms occupied substantial portions of many houses, reflecting the importance of maintaining reserves of grain, oil, dates, and other provisions that sustained families between harvests and provided security against crop failures or other disruptions. These storage areas contained rows of large ceramic jars measuring up to 1 metre tall, with capacities of 100 to 200 litres each. The jars were typically partially buried in the floor to provide stability and maintain cooler temperatures that helped preserve contents. Clay ceilings stamped with cylinder seals secured the jar mouths, protecting valuable contents from theft or contamination while documenting ownership and contents. Many houses included dedicated workspaces for craft production that supplemented household income. Evidence of textile production appears frequently, including clay spindle whorls used for spinning thread, loom weights that tensioned vertical looms, and bone tools for weaving and finishing cloth. Some houses contained pottery manufacturing evidence, including wheels, tools, and small kilns suitable for firing modest quantities of vessels for household use or local sale. Other craft activities documented in residential contexts include leatherworking, bone and ivory carving, and small-scale metalworking, producing tools, jewellery and decorative objects. The construction techniques employed in residential architecture utilised locally available materials and traditional building methods that had evolved over millennia. Walls were built from rectangular mud bricks measuring approximately 40 by 20 by 10 centimetres, shaped in wooden moulds and dried in the sun. These bricks were laid in courses with mud mortar binding them together, creating walls typically 40 to 60 centimetres thick for exterior walls and thinner partitions for interior room divisions. The walls supported flat roofs constructed from wooden beams spanned across rooms and covered with reed matting and packed earth that provided insulation and weather protection. The social stratification of Uruk society manifested clearly in residential architecture, with substantial variations in house size, construction quality, and luxury features. Elite residences in neighbourhoods adjacent to the Eanna precinct measured 200 square metres or more with elaborate multi-room plans. Superior construction materials, including some use of baked brick, and decorative elements such as wall paintings, carved stone thresholds, and imported wood for doors and columns. Middle-class houses of merchants and successful craftspeople occupied a middle range of 60 to 100 square metres, with solid construction and moderate amenities. The poorest inhabitants crowded into smaller dwellings of 20 to 40 square metres with minimal facilities, sometimes subdividing single rooms to house entire families. Administrative tablets from the Eanna precinct reveal that Uruk's temples functioned as complex economic institutions managing vast agricultural estates, employing thousands of workers and controlling extensive manufacturing and trade operations. The Temple of Eanna alone owned tens of thousands of sheep, controlled grain fields measuring in the thousands of hectares, and employed specialised craftspeople producing textiles, pottery, metalwork, and luxury goods for local consumption and long-distance trade. The economic power of Uruk's temples derived from their control of extensive landholdings, acquired through various means including royal donations, private dedications from wealthy individuals seeking divine favour, purchases using accumulated temple revenues, and foreclosures on debts owed to temple institutions. Administrative texts from the early dynastic period catalogue temple properties scattered across the Uruk countryside, including irrigated grain fields, date palm groves, pasture lands for livestock, and fishing rights in canals and marshes. The total area controlled by the Eanna temple complex exceeded 10,000 hectares, making it the largest landowner in the Uruk region. The management of these extensive agricultural operations required sophisticated administrative systems staffed by literate specialists who maintained detailed records of all transactions. Tablets recording field assignments document the allocation of specific plots to dependent labourers who received seed grain, tools, and rations in exchange for cultivating temple lands and delivering specified quotas of the harvest. Other texts track the performance of field supervisors responsible for organising ploughing, irrigation, weeding, and harvesting operations across multiple holdings. Failure to meet production quotas resulted in reduction of rations or reassignment to less favourable positions, creating incentives for efficient labour. The temple livestock operations represented another major component of institutional wealth. Texts from the Ur-III period provide detailed information about flocks numbering in the tens of thousands of sheep and goats managed by the temple administration. These animals provided wool for textile manufacturing, milk for dairy products, and meat for sacrificial offerings and rations to workers. Specialized shepherds moved flocks between seasonal pastures, following patterns that maximized grazing opportunities while avoiding conflicts with agricultural land use. Annual shearing operations yielded thousands of kilograms of wool that supplied temple textile workshops and generated surplus for trade. The manufacturing operations controlled by temple institutions transformed raw materials into finished goods that supplied internal needs and generated revenue through sales and trade. Textile production represented the largest manufacturing sector, with workshops employing hundreds of workers performing various stages of production. Texts document separate work groups responsible for cleaning and carding raw wool, spinning thread, weaving cloth on both horizontal and vertical looms, and finishing processes including fulling and dyeing. The output from these workshops measured in the thousands of garments and tens of thousands of square meters of cloth annually, supplying workers' rations, priestly vestments, offerings for deities, and trade goods. The temple administrative apparatus required to coordinate these diverse economic activities employed hundreds of literate scribes and officials organized into hierarchical departments responsible for different operational areas. Senior administrators bearing titles such as chief scribe, temple overseer, and property manager supervised teams of subordinate officials who handled specific functions, including field management, livestock operations, workshop supervision, and storage facility oversight. Regular accounting procedures required periodic submission of reports, documenting receipts, expenditures, and inventories that were compiled into summary statements reviewed by senior management and temple authorities. The redistributive functions of the temple economy played crucial roles in urban social organization by providing subsistence support for workers who did not produce their own food. Texts record standardized ration allocations measured in quantities of barley, oil, and sometimes other products distributed at regular intervals to workers performing various services. Adult male laborers received monthly rations of approximately 60 liters of barley, while women and children received reduced amounts reflecting assumptions about their consumption needs and economic value. Skilled craftspeople and officials received supplemental allocations including dates, fish, meat, and textiles, based on their positions in the institutional hierarchy. The temples also engaged in lending operations that provided seed grain and other necessities to farmers during planting seasons in exchange for repayment with interest after harvest. Interest rates varied depending on the type of commodity and prevailing economic conditions, but typically ranged from 20 to 33% annually for grain loans and 33 to 50% for silver loans. These credit operations generated substantial revenues while also creating dependency relationships that increased temple control over agricultural producers who risked losing land or personal freedom if they defaulted on obligations. The concentration of population in Uruk enabled unprecedented levels of craft specialization, with entire neighborhoods devoted to specific manufacturing activities. Archaeological evidence reveals pottery workshops capable of producing thousands of standardized vessels using fast potter's wheels, textile factories employing hundreds of workers at vertical looms, and metalworking facilities that processed copper, bronze, gold, and silver imported from distant sources. The pottery manufacturing district, identified through excavation and survey, occupied an area along the eastern edge of the city, where prevailing winds carried smoke and kiln emissions away from residential neighborhoods. Archaeological investigation of this zone uncovered the remains of numerous workshops containing potter's wheels, preparation areas for clay processing, and substantial kilns capable of firing hundreds of vessels in single batches. The concentration of pottery production in dedicated facilities rather than household workshops enabled economies of scale that reduced production costs and facilitated quality control and standardization. The fast potter's wheel represented a technological innovation that revolutionized ceramic production during the 4th millennium BC. Unlike earlier slow wheels that required manual rotation and limited the size and uniformity of produced vessels, the fast wheel utilized a heavy flywheel that maintained rotational momentum, enabling potters to shape clay using centrifugal force while focusing on forming vessel walls and profiles. Skilled wheel operators could produce standardized bowls, jars, and cups at rates of dozens per hour, compared to the much slower hand-building techniques used previously. The pottery workshops operated as integrated production facilities, combining all stages of the manufacturing process. Clay preparation areas contained installations for crushing raw clay, mixing it with water and tempering materials such as sand or crushed sherds, and aging the mixture to improve workability. Work areas included multiple potter's wheels operated simultaneously by teams of craftspeople, producing different vessel types according to standardized forms and sizes. Drying racks provided space for newly formed vessels to achieve leather-hard consistency before firing. The kilns themselves, constructed from fired brick and measuring several meters in diameter, utilized updraft designs that circulated hot gases from fireboxes through chambers containing stacked pottery, achieving temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius necessary for proper firing. The standardization of pottery production facilitated by workshop manufacturing enabled the creation of modular vessel forms suitable for specific purposes. Administrative texts reference pottery by standardized capacity measures, including vessels holding approximately 10 litres used for grain rations, 30-litre jars for oil storage, and large storage vessels exceeding 100 litres used for bulk commodities. The ability to produce vessels to consistent specifications supported the development of complex accounting systems that tracked commodities by standard units. Textile manufacturing occurred in dedicated workshops and larger factory-like installations employing predominantly female labour forces, organised into supervised work groups. Archaeological evidence of textile production appears primarily through recovered tools and installations rather than preserved textiles which rarely survive in Mesopotamian conditions. Excavations have uncovered thousands of clay spindle whorls used for spinning thread, loom weights that tensioned vertical looms, and bone and bronze tools used for weaving and finishing processes. The concentration of these artifacts in specific buildings and neighbourhoods indicates specialised production areas rather than purely household manufacture. Administrative texts provide detailed information about the organisation of institutional textile production. Large workshops employed workforces numbering in the hundreds divided into specialised teams performing different production stages. Wool preparation groups cleaned fleeces, removed vegetable matter and contaminants, and carded fibres to align them for spinning. Spinning teams, typically consisting of women and children, transformed prepared wool into thread using drop spindles weighted with clay or stone whorls. The thread was organised by thickness and quality for different weaving applications. Weaving teams operated vertical looms producing various cloth types, ranging from coarse fabrics suitable for sacks and work clothing to fine textiles used for luxury garments and trade goods. The metalworking facilities concentrated in neighbourhoods on the urban periphery where fire hazards and smoke from furnaces posed minimal threats to densely packed residential areas. Archaeological investigation of these zones has uncovered workshop structures containing crucibles, moulds, slag heaps, and other debris from smelting and casting operations. The workshops processed imported raw copper and tin into bronze alloys, refined precious metals including gold and silver, and manufactured finished products ranging from utilitarian tools and weapons to elaborate vessels and jewellery. The technical knowledge required for successful metalworking included understanding of ore properties, smelting temperatures, alloy ratios, casting techniques, and finishing processes. Copper smelting required temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius achieved in furnaces using charcoal fuel and forced air provided by bellows. The production of bronze required careful control of tin content, typically between 10 and 12% by weight, to create alloys with optimal properties for different applications. Casting techniques included simple open molds for basic shapes, piece molds for more complex forms, and lost wax casting for intricate designs requiring fine detail. Uruk's prosperity depended on extensive trade networks that brought essential raw materials unavailable in the resource-poor southern Mesopotamian plain. Timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, copper from Oman and Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus Valley, and obsidian from Anatolia reached Uruk through complex exchange systems involving river transport, overland caravans, and merchant intermediaries operating across thousands of kilometers. The geographical limitations of southern Mesopotamia created fundamental dependencies on long-distance trade for materials essential to urban civilization. The alluvial plain lacked timber suitable for construction and toolmaking, stone for building and tool manufacture, metal ores for producing copper and bronze implements, and semi-precious stones valued for decorative and prestige purposes. Meeting these needs required establishing trade connections extending across the entire ancient Near East and beyond into Central Asia and the Indus Valley. The cedar forests of the Levant supplied the timber necessary for roof beams, door frames, columns, and boat construction. These mighty trees growing in the mountains of modern Lebanon and Syria produced straight-grained wood resistant to decay that could span the wide rooms characteristic of Mesopotamian architecture. Texts describe expeditions to the Cedar Mountains organized by Uruk's rulers who claimed divine authorization for exploiting these resources. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself centers on a journey to the cedar forest, where Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu slay the guardian Humbaba to secure timber for Uruk's buildings. While legendary, this narrative reflects the historical importance of securing timber supplies for major construction projects. Copper sources in Oman, southeastern Anatolia, and possibly Cyprus supplied the raw metal necessary for producing tools, weapons, and decorative objects. The copper trade appears to have operated through multiple channels, including direct expeditions sent by temple institutions, independent merchants who purchased copper at source regions and transported it to Mesopotamian markets, and intermediary trading centers that connected distant producers with ultimate consumers. Chemical analysis of copper artifacts from Uruk using trace element signatures and lead isotope ratios has identified probable source regions demonstrating the extent of trade connections. The lapis lazuli trade represents one of the most remarkable examples of long-distance exchange in the ancient world. This brilliant blue stone, prized for its color and rarity, originated in the Badakhshan region of northeastern Afghanistan, over 2,500 kilometers from Uruk. The transport of this valuable material across such vast distances required complex networks of intermediaries, moving goods through multiple stages from source to final destination. Lapis appears in Uruk contexts beginning in the Uruk period and becomes increasingly common during the early dynastic period, when it was used for cylinder seals, beads, inlay work, and small sculptures demonstrating elite status. The carnelian bead industry, centered in the Indus Valley region, supplied reddish-orange semi-precious stones that were worked into elaborate bead necklaces and other ornaments. The technical expertise of Indus craftspeople in heating carnelian to alter and standardize its color, drilling long, perfectly straight holes through hard stone beads, and producing standardized forms made these products highly valued throughout Mesopotamia. The presence of carnelian beads manufactured using distinctively Indus techniques in Uruk contexts demonstrates trade connections extending to the eastern edges of the ancient world. The obsidian trade brought volcanic glass from sources in Anatolia and Armenia to Mesopotamia, where its sharp edges made it valuable for cutting tools and ceremonial objects. Chemical characterization of obsidian artifacts through neutron activation analysis and X-ray fluorescence has identified specific volcanic sources demonstrating the precision with which trade routes can be reconstructed through material analysis. The distribution patterns of obsidian from different sources changed through time, reflecting shifts in trade routes and political relationships that affected access to particular source regions. Textile manufacturing represented one of Uruk's most important economic activities, with temple and private. Workshops employing thousands of workers in the labor-intensive processes of shearing sheep, cleaning and carding wool, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and finishing fabrics. Administrative texts record complex organizational systems that tracked workers, raw materials, and finished products through multiple stages of production. with specialized workers receiving different ration allotments based on their skills and productivity. The textile industry's importance to Uruk's economy derived from multiple factors, including the universal need for clothing and household textiles, the suitability of textile products for long-distance trade, and the capacity of organized production to generate substantial surpluses beyond subsistence needs. Temple institutions controlled the largest textile manufacturing operations, but private workshops and household production also contributed significantly to total output. The combination of institutional and private production created a complex textile economy that supplied local consumption while generating exports that brought wealth to the city. The production process began with sheep herding operations that maintained flocks numbering in the tens of thousands on pasture land surrounding Uruk and in more distant grazing territories. Administrative texts track the composition of temple flocks with careful attention to the ratio of rams, ewes, and lambs that optimized wool production while maintaining reproductive capacity. Shepherds received detailed instructions regarding seasonal movements between summer and winter pastures, breeding schedules, and protection against predators and theft. Annual shearing operations conducted in spring yielded fleeces averaging between 1.5 and 2.5 kilograms per animal, depending on breed and nutritional status. The cleaning and preparation of raw wool required substantial labor to remove dirt, vegetable matter, and natural oils that interfered with spinning and dyeing. Workers soaked fleeces in water, sometimes with the addition of alkaline substances to help dissolve grease, then beat and trampled the wool to loosen contaminants. After washing, the wool was spread on reed mats or racks to dry in the sun. Once dry, workers used carding tools consisting of wooden paddles set with bronze or bone teeth to align the fibers and remove remaining debris, creating prepared wool suitable for spinning. Spinning transformed the prepared wool into thread through the use of drop spindles weighted with clay or stone whorls. This process required considerable skill to maintain consistent thread thickness, while adding the proper amount of twist to create strong yarn. Spinners, predominantly women and children, worked in groups within workshop courtyards where supervisors monitored output and quality. Administrative texts record daily production quotas varying by thread thickness and worker skill level, with experienced spinners producing up to 1 kilogram of fine thread per day, while less skilled workers, or those producing coarser yarns, achieved different output levels. The thread quality determined its ultimate use, with fine, tightly spun yarn reserved for luxury textiles, while coarser, loosely spun thread sufficed for utilitarian fabrics. Multiple threads could be plied together to create stronger yarns suitable for specific weaving applications. The spun thread was wound onto bobbins or formed into balls for storage and transport to weaving facilities. Temple administrative systems tracked thread inventory, with the same precision applied to other commodities, recording quantities by weight, quality grade, and intended application. Weaving operations utilized both horizontal ground looms and vertical frame looms depending on the type of fabric being produced and workshop traditions. Horizontal looms, stretched on the ground and held in tension by stakes or pegs, were operated by weavers sitting or kneeling alongside the loom. These looms produced narrower fabrics, typically less than 1 meter wide, but could create very long pieces limited only by the available workspace. Vertical looms, suspended from upper beams with warp threads tensioned by clay or stone weights, enabled production of wider fabrics and were better suited for complex patterns created by varying the interlacing of warp and weft threads. The weaving process itself required coordination between preparing the loom by mounting warp threads in proper tension and spacing, and the actual weaving work of passing weft threads through the warp to create cloth. Setting up a loom represented a significant time investment that encouraged weavers to produce long runs of similar fabric, rather than frequently changing to different patterns or thread types. Workshop organization typically assigned groups of weavers to produce specific fabric types continuously, with supervisors coordinating production to meet anticipated demand for different cloth grades. Finishing processes transformed raw woven cloth into finished textiles suitable for use or sale. Fulling operations cleaned fabrics while creating tighter weaves through mechanical working of wet cloth, by trampling or beating. Some fabrics received napping treatments that raised surface fibers to create softer textures. Dyeing operations added color using pigments derived from plant, animal, and mineral sources including madder for red shades, indigo for blues, and various yellows from plant materials. The chemistry of dyeing required expertise in preparing dye baths, mordanting fabrics to improve colour uptake and fastness, and achieving consistent results across production batches. The finished textiles varied enormously in quality, from coarse undyed fabrics suitable for sacks and work clothing, to fine smooth fabrics finished with expensive dyes used for elite garments and traded as luxury goods. Administrative texts distinguished dozens of textile types, using technical terminology that specified fabric weight, weave structure, finishing treatments, and intended applications. The most valuable textiles commanded prices measured in significant quantities of silver or grain, making them suitable stores of value and important components of long-distance trade. The economic organization of textile production created employment for thousands of workers while generating substantial revenues for temple institutions and private entrepreneurs. The labor-intensive nature of textile production meant that most production costs represented worker rations and supervision rather than raw material expenses, though high-quality dyes and specialized finishing materials added significant costs for luxury fabrics. The scale economies achieved through organized production in large workshops enabled lower unit costs than household production, while maintaining quality through specialized labor and supervisory oversight. The invention of the fast potter's wheel around 3400 BC revolutionized ceramic production, enabling skilled craftspeople to produce standardized vessels at unprecedented rates. Archaeological excavations of pottery workshops reveal specialized facilities with multiple wheels, large kilns capable of firing hundreds of pots simultaneously, and storage areas containing thousands of finished vessels ready for distribution through temple redistributive systems or sale in urban markets. The technological innovation of the fast potter's wheel fundamentally transformed ceramic production methods and the economic organization of pottery manufacture. Earlier slow wheels or tournettes required continuous manual rotation limiting their speed and the centrifugal forces available for shaping clay. The fast wheel utilized a heavy stone or clay flywheel mounted on a vertical axle that stored rotational energy, allowing sustained high-speed rotation. The potter kicked or pushed the flywheel to build momentum, then shaped clay on the upper wheel head, while the flywheel maintained rotation, freeing both hands for forming operations. The increased production speed enabled by fast wheels created opportunities for craft specialization and workshop-based production, replacing household pottery making. A skilled wheel operator could produce dozens of standardized vessels in a single day, compared to the much slower production rates achievable through hand-building or slow wheel techniques. This productivity increase made centralized workshop production economically attractive, since specialists could supply the needs of many households while maintaining higher quality standards than typical household potters achieved. Archaeological investigation of pottery manufacturing districts identified through concentrations of kiln debris, waster sherds, and production tools reveals the spatial organization and scale of workshop operations. The German expedition's excavations in areas designated as the Pottery Quarter uncovered remains of numerous workshop structures dating from the late Uruk through early dynastic periods. These facilities typically measured between 100 and 300 square meters and contained multiple work areas supporting different stages of production. The clay preparation areas included installations for storing raw clay, mixing it with water and tempering materials, and aging the prepared clay to improve workability. Potters obtained clay from deposits along riverbanks and canal margins, where seasonal flooding renewed accessible sources. The clay required cleaning to remove stones, organic material, and other contaminants before mixing with temper materials including sand, crushed sherds, or chopped straw that reduced shrinkage and cracking during drying and firing. The prepared clay was stored in covered pits or vessels, where controlled moisture levels maintained optimal consistency. The wheel-throwing areas contained multiple potter's wheels arranged to maximize natural light from doorways or roof openings. Each wheel station included workspace for preparing clay, storage for tools, and drying racks where newly formed vessels could achieve leather-hard consistency suitable for trimming and adding handles or spouts. Archaeological evidence reveals that workshops employed several potters working simultaneously, with production organized to maximize efficiency through specialized task assignment. Some potters focused on producing particular vessel forms repeatedly, while others prepared clay, trimmed dried vessels, or applied decorative elements. The kilns represented the most substantial capital investment in pottery workshops and required considerable technical expertise to construct and operate successfully. The typical kiln design employed updraft principles with a firebox at ground level or slightly below, a perforated floor separating the firebox from the firing chamber, and a domed roof with vents for controlling airflow and heat circulation. The kiln walls were constructed from fired brick 1/2 to 1 meter thick, providing insulation that maintained high temperatures while protecting the exterior from heat damage. Operating a kiln required careful control of fuel type and feeding rate, airflow through adjustable vents, and firing duration to achieve proper ceramic transformation. The firing cycle typically lasted between 12 and 24 hours, depending on kiln size and vessel types being fired. Potters loaded vessels into the firing chamber in carefully arranged stacks that maximised capacity, while allowing hot gases to circulate around all pieces. The kiln was sealed and fired using wood or reed fuel, fed continuously through the firebox opening. Skilled kiln operators monitored temperature through observation ports and adjusted firing conditions to achieve temperatures between 700 and 900 degrees Celsius, necessary for proper clay transformation. The storage and distribution facilities within pottery workshops contained finished vessels organised by type and size, awaiting delivery to customers or distribution through institutional systems. Archaeological excavations have uncovered storage rooms containing hundreds of standardised vessels stacked in organised arrangements. Temple administrative texts record pottery deliveries measured in standardised units, documenting the flow of vessels from production workshops to institutional storage facilities and ultimately to end users through ration distributions or commercial sales. The standardisation of vessel forms facilitated by wheel production and workshop manufacturing created pottery types, optimised for specific functions. Beveled rim bowls, one of the most distinctive Uruk period ceramic types, were mass-produced in standard sizes suitable for measuring grain rations. These simple conical vessels with characteristic beveled rims could be produced at rates exceeding 100 per day by skilled wheel operators, making them essentially disposable containers used for a single ration distribution then discarded. Other standardized types included storage jars in various capacities, serving bowls, cooking pots, and specialized forms for industrial or ritual applications. Uruk metalworkers mastered sophisticated techniques for casting copper and bronze into tools, weapons, and decorative objects using lost wax casting, hammer forging, and joining methods that produced everything from simple pins and needles to elaborate vessels and ceremonial weapons. The city's demand for metal required constant importation of raw copper and tin from distant sources, with merchants travelling to Oman, Anatolia, and possibly even further afield to obtain necessary supplies. The development of metallurgical expertise represented one of humanity's most significant technological achievements, transforming copper and bronze from rare precious materials into utilitarian commodities that revolutionized toolmaking and enabled new forms of social organization and warfare. Uruk's metalworkers built upon millennia of experimentation and knowledge accumulation, extending back to the earliest copper smelting operations in the 6th millennium BC, gradually developing the technical repertoire necessary for reliable production of high-quality metal artifacts. The fundamental challenge of metalworking involved achieving and controlling the high temperatures necessary for smelting ores and melting refined metals. Copper melting requires temperatures exceeding 1080 degrees Celsius, while bronze alloys melt at slightly lower temperatures depending on tin content. These temperatures far exceed what simple fires can achieve, necessitating the development of furnaces that concentrate heat and forced air systems using bellows that increase oxygen supply to fuel combustion. Archaeological evidence from metalworking sites includes furnace remains, slag deposits, and crucible fragments that demonstrate the technical solutions Uruk craftspeople employed. The furnaces used for smelting and melting consisted of clay-lined pits, or built structures containing fireboxes, crucibles for holding metal, and provision for forced air delivery. Bellows constructed from leather bags with wooden frames and nozzles directed air into the furnace base, where it passed through burning charcoal, generating intense heat. Multiple bellows operated in alternation maintained continuous airflow, necessary for sustaining high temperatures. The crucibles, manufactured from refractory clays that resisted thermal shock and chemical attack by molten metal, served as containers for smelting ore, or melting refined metal prior to casting. The production of bronze required obtaining both copper and tin in metallic form, then alloying them in proper proportions to achieve desired properties. The typical bronze composition contained approximately 10% tin by weight, creating alloys harder and more durable than pure copper, while remaining workable through casting and forging techniques. Achieving consistent alloy composition required careful weighing of components and thorough mixing during melting to ensure uniform distribution of tin throughout the copper matrix. Metalworkers developed empirical knowledge of optimal compositions for different applications, with higher tin content, producing harder but more brittle alloys, suitable for cutting tools, while lower tin content created tougher metals, better suited for items requiring impact resistance. The casting techniques employed by Uruk metalworkers included both simple open molds and more sophisticated closed mold systems. Open molds carved from stone or formed from fired clay produced basic shapes including flat axes, simple tools, and ingots for later working. These molds created one-sided castings requiring subsequent forging and grinding to produce finished objects. Piece molds constructed from multiple sections that fitted together enabled production of more complex three-dimensional forms including vessels, figurines, and elaborate tools. The mold sections were carefully carved to create the desired negative space, assembled around a core if hollow castings were intended, and tightly bound together during pouring. The lost wax or investment casting technique enabled production of objects with intricate details impossible to achieve through other methods. This process involved creating a model of the desired object in beeswax, covering it with multiple layers of fine clay to form a mold, heating the assembly to melt out the wax, leaving a cavity matching the original model, then pouring molten metal into the cavity. After cooling, the clay mold was broken away, revealing the cast metal object, preserving even fine details from the wax original. This technique required considerable skill in wax working, mold making, and metal pouring, but produced results unmatched by other casting methods. Forging techniques shaped cast or smelted metal through controlled heating and hammering that compressed and refined the metal's internal structure while forming desired shapes. Metalworkers heated bronze to dull red temperatures, then hammered it against anvils using various specialized hammers that stretched, thinned, and shaped the material. The working hardened the metal through cold working effects that eventually required annealing by reheating to restore workability. Skilled smiths combined casting and forging techniques, casting rough blanks, then forging them to final shapes that combined the efficiency of casting with the refined properties achieved through forging. The joining of metal components to create complex objects employed several techniques including mechanical fastening, soldering, and welding. Riveting used metal pins inserted through aligned holes and hammered to create permanent joints suitable for attaching handles to vessels or joining armor plates. Soldering employed lower melting alloys that bonded components when heated without melting the base metals, useful for jewelry making and delicate repairs. Welding achieved direct fusion of metal components through heating to near-melting temperatures and hammering the softened metals together, creating monolithic joints in items requiring maximum strength. The demand for copper and tin to supply Uruk's metalworking industry required extensive trade networks connecting the city to distant source regions. Copper deposits in Oman, southeastern Anatolia, Cyprus, and possibly Iran supplied most of Uruk's copper through complex exchange systems involving multiple intermediaries. The tin sources remain more uncertain, but likely included deposits in the Zagros Mountains, Afghanistan, or even more distant Central Asian sources. The rarity of tin and the distances involved in obtaining it made bronze substantially more expensive than copper, restricting bronze use to applications where its superior properties justified the additional cost. The complexity of Uruk's administrative systems required literate specialists capable of reading and writing cuneiform, performing mathematical calculations, and maintaining detailed records. Scribal schools, known as tablet houses, trained young men from elite families in the difficult art of cuneiform writing through years of practice, copying standard texts, learning thousands of signs, and mastering specialized vocabulary for legal, administrative, and literary documents. The invention of writing created immediate demand for specialists who could produce and interpret written documents, leading to the development of formal educational institutions dedicated to training scribes. These scribal schools, operating under temple or palace sponsorship, recruited students from families wealthy enough to support children through years of education rather than requiring their labour for household subsistence. The selection process favoured sons of existing scribes, administrators, and wealthy merchants who could benefit from literacy in managing family enterprises and pursuing administrative careers. The curriculum of scribal education progressed through stages of increasing complexity, extending over periods of 10 to 15 years for students pursuing advanced training. Beginning students started with the most basic elements, including learning to prepare clay tablets of proper consistency, holding the reed stylus correctly, and forming the elementary wedge-shaped impressions that constituted cuneiform signs. The earliest exercises involved copying simple signs repeatedly, until students achieved consistent control over stylus pressure and angle that produced clear legible impressions. As students mastered basic sign formation, they progressed to copying standard sign lists that organize cuneiform symbols by various principles, including phonetic value, semantic meaning, and graphic similarity. These lexical lists served multiple pedagogical purposes, including teaching sign forms, introducing vocabulary, and providing reference resources for identifying unfamiliar signs encountered in texts. The most important sign lists were copied repeatedly throughout a scribe's training, with earlier versions containing only sign forms and pronunciations, while advanced versions added Sumerian words, Akkadian translations, and contextual information about proper usage. Mathematical training formed another essential component of scribal education, since administrative work required calculating areas, volumes, weights, and values in various measurement systems. Students learned the sexagesimal base 60 numerical system through copying mathematical tables, including multiplication tables, reciprocal tables enabling division operations, and tables of constants for geometric calculations. More advanced mathematical instruction covered solutions to practical problems, including field area calculations, construction material estimates, and commercial accounting scenarios. The mathematical texts reveal sophisticated understanding of abstract mathematical relationships, including early algebraic concepts and geometric principles. Advanced students progressed to copying literary compositions, legal formulas, and specialized administrative texts relevant to their anticipated careers. The literary curriculum included myths, epics, hymns, and wisdom literature that transmitted cultural values while providing models of sophisticated language use. Students copied standard versions of compositions including the Gilgamesh epic, creation myths, and royal hymns, memorizing large portions through repeated copying. The legal and administrative texts introduced specialized vocabulary and formulaic expressions used in contracts, court records, and institutional accounting documents. The physical facilities of scribal schools consisted of dedicated buildings or sections of larger temple or palace complexes containing instruction rooms, libraries of reference texts, and storage for student exercises. Archaeological evidence from sites including Nippur and Ur reveals school buildings with benches for students, archives of student practice tablets, and collections of standard texts used for instruction. The teacher-student ratios appear to have been relatively small, with senior scribes supervising groups of perhaps 10 to 20 students working at various levels of advancement. The teaching methods emphasized repetition and memorization, with students copying the same text dozens or hundreds of times until they could reproduce them from memory. Teachers provided model tablets demonstrating correct sign forms and compositions, which students copied repeatedly, gradually internalizing the conventions of written language. More advanced students served as teaching assistants helping beginners, while reinforcing their own mastery through instruction of others. The competitive atmosphere encouraged excellence, with successful students gaining prestigious positions, while those who failed to master the curriculum faced limited career prospects. The graduation from scribal training qualified students for various administrative positions depending on their family connections, areas of specialized study, and demonstrated abilities. The most talented scribes might advance to senior administrative positions managing temple or palace operations, while others found employment as commercial scribes serving merchant enterprises, estate managers, or private individuals requiring occasional document preparation. The scribal profession provided pathways for social advancement, since literacy commanded respect, and provided access to positions of authority despite requiring no manual labour. Maintaining order in a city of 50,000 required formal legal institutions capable of resolving disputes, punishing crimes, and enforcing contracts. Early legal documents from Uruk record cases involving property disputes, debt claims, inheritance conflicts, and commercial disagreements that were adjudicated by assemblies of elders, temple officials, or royal judges who rendered decisions based on customary law and precedent. The legal systems of early Mesopotamian cities developed organically from customary dispute resolution practices, as urban concentration and economic complexity created conflicts that informal mechanisms could not adequately address. The earliest legal procedures involved community elders who rendered judgments in disputes based on their knowledge of traditional practices and their authority within local social networks. As cities grew and economic relationships became more complex, these informal procedures evolved into more formalized systems, with designated judges, standardized procedures, and written records documenting proceedings and decisions. The judicial authorities in Uruk included several overlapping jurisdictions reflecting the city's complex political organization. The assemblies of elders retained authority over many civil disputes, particularly those involving property rights, inheritance, and family matters among ordinary citizens. These assemblies consisted of respected senior men from the neighborhood or professional group involved in the dispute, who heard testimony, examined evidence, and rendered collective decisions. Temple officials exercised jurisdiction over matters involving temple property, personnel, and religious obligations, with priests serving as judges in cases affecting institutional interests. Royal judges appointed by the king handled cases involving royal property, serious crimes, and appeals from lower jurisdictions. The legal procedures employed in Uruk courts followed patterns that would characterize Mesopotamian law for millennia. Cases typically began with formal complaints filed by aggrieved parties who presented their claims orally before the relevant judicial authority. The opposing party received notification and opportunity to respond with counterclaims or defences. Both parties could present witnesses who testified under oath, invoking divine punishment for false testimony. Physical evidence, including contracts, account records, and property markers, could be introduced to support claims. After hearing all evidence, the judges deliberated and announced their decision, which was recorded in writing and witnessed by officials. The types of cases documented in legal texts from Uruk and contemporary cities reveal the conflicts generated by urban life and commercial economy. Property disputes arose from unclear boundaries, conflicting claims to inheritance, and disagreements over sales or transfers. The judges examined title documents, questioned witnesses about traditional boundaries, and inspected physical property to render decisions. Debt cases involved claims for repayment of loans or performance of obligations recorded in written contracts. The creditors presented loan documents stamped with the debtor's seal, while debtors claimed repayment or contested the terms. Judges enforced valid debts while providing relief in cases of fraud or impossibility of performance. Commercial disputes arose from failed business partnerships, contested contract performance, and disagreements over quality or quantity of delivered goods. Merchant contracts specified obligations in detail, but disputes still arose over interpretation and performance. Judges examined contracts, heard testimony about customary commercial practices, and rendered decisions that maintained commercial confidence while achieving equity between parties. Inheritance conflicts pitted siblings against each other or challenged dispositions made by testators, requiring judges to balance written wills against customary inheritance rules that provided for all legitimate heirs. The enforcement of judicial decisions relied on social pressure, economic sanctions, and in extreme cases, physical punishment. Parties who defied court orders faced public condemnation that damaged their reputations and limited future commercial opportunities. Debtors who failed to satisfy judgments faced seizure of property or enslavement to work off debts. Serious crimes, including theft, assault, and fraud, could result in corporal punishment, mutilation, or execution depending on severity and the status of victims and perpetrators. The enforcement mechanisms required cooperation from community members who participated in property seizures and witnessed punishments that publicly demonstrated the consequences of violating legal norms. The development of written law codes represented a later evolution of these customary legal systems, as rulers sought to standardize procedures and establish their authority as sources of justice. While no law code survives from Uruk itself, later Mesopotamian codes, including the laws of Ur-Nammu and the Code of Hammurabi, preserve legal principles and procedures that developed during the early dynastic period. These codes established standard penalties for various offences, regulated commercial transactions, protected property rights, and provided procedures for resolving disputes. The written codes supplemented rather than replaced customary law, with judges exercising discretion in applying general principles to specific cases. The concentration of wealth and population in Uruk made the city both a powerful military force capable of dominating surrounding regions and an attractive target for raids and conquest attempts. Military organisation centred on levies of free citizens who served as infantry armed with spears and shields, supplemented by small numbers of elite warriors equipped with more expensive bronze weapons and possibly simple chariots or donkey-drawn battle carts. The military institutions of early Uruk evolved from the need to protect agricultural communities from raids by nomadic pastoralists and rival settlements, competing for water resources and productive land. As the city grew and accumulated wealth in the form of stored grain, manufactured goods, and precious materials, it became an increasingly attractive target for organised military action. Simultaneously, Uruk's expanding population and economic ambitions created pressures to dominate surrounding territories and control trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with distant resource regions. The military obligations of citizenship required able-bodied free men to serve in the city's defence when called upon by royal or temple authorities. This militia system provided large numbers of infantry soldiers without requiring the maintenance of standing professional armies that would have consumed substantial resources. The citizen soldiers received basic military training during peacetime, including practice with weapons and formations, but they remained primarily farmers, craftspeople, and labourers who took up arms only during military emergencies or organised campaigns. The standard infantry equipment consisted of wooden spears with fire-hardened or copper-tipped points, leather or reed shields offering protection against projectiles and hand weapons, and simple helmets of leather or copper providing limited head protection. The spears measured approximately 2 meters in length, enabling soldiers to strike enemies while maintaining some distance, with the longer reach providing advantages against opponents armed with shorter weapons. The shields, typically circular or rectangular in shape, and measuring between 50 and 80 centimeters across, were constructed from wood or woven reeds covered with leather and sometimes reinforced with metal fittings. The more prosperous citizens who could afford superior equipment formed elite units within the militia forces. These better-equipped soldiers carried bronze-tipped spears and axes, wore metal helmets providing improved protection, and sometimes possessed body armour of leather reinforced with metal scales or plates. Their superior equipment and more intensive training made them more effective in combat, and they typically occupied the front ranks of formations where their presence provided confidence to less experienced soldiers positioned behind them. The tactical employment of infantry forces emphasized dense formations that maximized the protective value of shields, while presenting unified fronts of spear points to advancing enemies. The phalanx-like formations required training and discipline to maintain cohesion during advances and to avoid breaking ranks under pressure. Soldiers in the front ranks engaged enemies directly while those behind provided support by thrusting spears over their comrades' shoulders or replacing casualties. The success of these formations depended on numerical superiority and the ability to maintain formation integrity under the stress of combat. Archaeological evidence for early Mesopotamian warfare appears in artistic depictions on cylinder seals, stone reliefs, and inlaid plaques showing organised military activities. The stele of the vultures from Lagash, though dating slightly later than the early Uruk period, depicts the phalanx formation with helmeted soldiers carrying spears and large shields, arranged in tight ranks trampling fallen enemies. Similar iconography from cylinder seals shows military processions, siege operations, and individual combat scenes that document military technologies and tactics. The elite warrior class that emerged during the early dynastic period included specialized soldiers who devoted more time to martial training and received superior equipment reflecting their status. These warriors formed the king's personal retinue and led citizen militia forces during campaigns. Their prestige derived from military prowess and success in battle, with successful war leaders accumulating followers and resources that enhanced their political power. The relationship between military success and political authority meant that ambitious individuals could rise through military service, while established rulers needed military victories to maintain legitimacy. The introduction of wheeled vehicles during the late 4th millennium BC created opportunities for developing mobile striking forces, though the earliest examples from Uruk were probably slow, heavy wagons, rather than the swift chariots of later periods. These battle carts, drawn by donkeys or onagers, carried crews of 2 to 4 soldiers into combat, providing mobility and elevated positions for launching projectiles. The psychological impact of these vehicles may have exceeded their direct military effectiveness, since the noise and appearance of advancing carts could intimidate enemies unfamiliar with such technology. The conduct of warfare during the Uruk period centered primarily on raids to capture livestock, slaves, and portable wealth, and sieges of rival cities to force submission or extract tribute. Field battles occurred when opposing forces met during raids or campaigns, but the lack of decisive tactical innovations meant such encounters often devolved into bloody pushes between opposing phalanxes until one side's morale broke and survivors fled. The victors pursued fleeing enemies, inflicting casualties and capturing prisoners who could be enslaved or ransomed. Siege operations required different tactics and technologies, including surrounding enemy settlements to prevent escape and resupply, constructing earth ramps to overcome defensive walls, and possibly using battering rams or fire to breach fortifications. The defenders could resist for extended periods if they had adequate food and water supplies, making siege success dependent on starving defenders into submission or exploiting internal divisions to negotiate surrender. The massive defensive walls constructed at Uruk and other cities during the early dynastic period reflect the importance of siege warfare and the substantial investments communities made in passive defense. Archaeological excavation of Uruk cemeteries reveals diverse burial practices reflecting social hierarchies and religious beliefs about the afterlife. Common people were typically buried in simple graves beneath house floors or in extramural cemeteries with minimal grave goods, while elites received more elaborate treatment with offerings of pottery vessels, jewellery, weapons, and sometimes human sacrifices buried to accompany the deceased. The treatment of the dead in ancient Uruk reflected fundamental beliefs about the continuation of personal existence after physical death, and the relationship between the living and deceased members of the community. Mesopotamian religious thought conceived the afterlife as a dreary underworld realm where the shades of the dead existed in diminished form, sustained by food and drink offerings provided by living descendants. This understanding created obligations for proper burial and ongoing memorial offerings that maintained connections between the living and the dead. The most common burial practice for ordinary inhabitants involved interment beneath the floors of family houses where the deceased remained physically present within the domestic space. The graves were typically simple rectangular pits excavated through floor surfaces into the underlying soil, measuring just large enough to accommodate the body in a flexed position, with knees drawn up toward the chest. This position may have represented a return to the fetal posture, or simply reflected the practical consideration of minimizing grave size and the amount of earth requiring excavation. The burial preparations involved wrapping the body in reed matting or cloth shrouds before placement in the grave. The corpse was positioned on its side in the flexed posture, with the head oriented toward a particular direction, though no consistent orientation pattern appears across all burials. A few pottery vessels containing food and drink offerings were placed near the body to provide sustenance for the deceased's journey to the underworld and initial period of afterlife existence. The grave was then filled with earth and the house floor resurfaced, sometimes with a marking to indicate the burial location. The positioning of burials beneath house floors served multiple purposes beyond simple convenience. The practice maintained family bonds by keeping ancestors physically present within the household, where their spirits could watch over and protect living descendants. The location also ensured that descendants would remember to provide ongoing offerings of food and drink poured into the ground to nourish the spirits of buried family members. The practice created continuity across generations by anchoring families to specific houses and neighborhoods that contained the graves of their ancestors. Extramural cemeteries located outside the city walls provided burial space for families without access to house floor interments and for individuals who died without family connections or resources for private burials. These cemetery areas contained hundreds or thousands of simple graves marked by small stones or left unmarked, creating dense concentrations of burials that accumulated over generations of use. The graves in these cemeteries followed similar patterns to house floor burials with flexed bodies wrapped in matting and accompanied by minimal grave goods. The elite burials discovered through archaeological excavation demonstrate dramatically different treatment reflecting the wealth and social status of the deceased. These elaborate graves typically consisted of constructed tomb chambers rather than simple pits, with walls of mud brick or stone creating underground rooms that could accommodate the body in extended rather than flexed position, along with substantial quantities of grave goods. The construction of such tombs required significant labour and materials representing substantial expenditures by surviving family members or the deceased's estate. The grave goods accompanying elite burials included far greater quantities and higher quality offerings than those found in common graves. Multiple pottery vessels, including large storage jars, serving bowls, and specialized forms held food and drink offerings in quantities sufficient for extended afterlife sustenance. Jewellery of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and carnelian adorned the body, demonstrating the wealth and status achieved during life. Weapons, including daggers, axes, and sometimes ceremonial maces, identified male burials of warrior or royal status. Cylinder seals bearing the deceased name and titles served as markers of administrative authority and personal identity. The most elaborate elite burials included evidence for human sacrifice with retainers, servants, or family members buried alongside the primary occupant. These secondary burials appear in tombs from the early dynastic period, with individuals positioned around the main burial apparently having been killed to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The practice reflects beliefs that the dead required servants and attendants in the afterlife, just as they had during earthly life, though the scale of such sacrifices remained modest compared to the massive retainer burials documented at contemporary sites like the Royal Cemetery of Ur. The tomb chambers of the wealthiest individuals sometimes included architectural elaboration with multiple rooms, decorated walls, and provisions for ongoing access by living family members who could enter to provide offerings. These accessible tombs functioned almost as houses for the dead, with spaces for storing offerings and conducting memorial rituals. The continued care of such tombs across generations demonstrated family piety and maintained the social prestige associated with connection to powerful ancestors. The religious beliefs underlying these burial practices centered on concepts of the Kur, or underworld realm ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, where the dead existed in shadowy form. The journey to this realm required the deceased to cross rivers and pass through gates guarded by demons who could be placated with offerings. The quality of afterlife existence depended partly on proper burial and ongoing offerings from descendants with those who died without proper burial or memorial offerings suffering particularly wretched fates. These beliefs created powerful motivations for families to ensure proper burial of deceased members and to maintain long-term commitments to memorial offerings. Artistic depictions and archaeological finds indicate that Uruk's inhabitants enjoyed various forms of entertainment during limited leisure time. Musical instruments, including lyres, harps, drums, and flutes, provided accompaniment for religious ceremonies and secular celebrations, while board games and dice offered diversions for those with sufficient wealth and free time to engage in recreational activities. The role of entertainment and leisure activities in ancient Uruk remained secondary to the demands of subsistence and survival that consumed most people's time and energy. The agricultural calendar required intensive labour during planting and harvest seasons, with additional work maintaining irrigation systems, tending livestock, and performing the countless other tasks necessary for survival. Urban craftspeople worked long hours meeting production quotas or customer orders, with little time remaining for recreational pursuits. Nevertheless, religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, and occasional rest days provided opportunities for entertainment that relieved the tedium of daily labour and strengthened community bonds. Musical performance represented the most widespread form of entertainment accessible to all social classes. Archaeological evidence of musical instruments appears in tomb deposits, where lyres, harps, and other instruments accompanied elite burials, and in artistic depictions on cylinder seals and stone reliefs showing musicians performing during religious ceremonies and royal banquets. The instruments themselves rarely survive due to their construction from perishable materials including wood, gut strings and leather, but occasional discoveries of decorated sound boxes and string attachments preserve evidence of sophisticated instrument construction. The lyre represented one of the most important musical instruments, with multiple strings stretched across a wooden frame and sound box that resonated the vibrations created by plucking the strings. The number of strings varied from 5 to 11 or more, with each string tuned to a different pitch, enabling musicians to play melodies and harmonies. The sound boxes were sometimes elaborately decorated with inlays of shell, lapis lazuli, and other precious materials depicting mythological scenes or geometric patterns. The construction required considerable skill in woodworking, leather preparation for drumheads covering the sound box, and string manufacture from twisted animal gut. The harp differed from the lyre in having an angled frame with strings of graduated lengths producing different pitches. These instruments range from small portable versions with 5 or 6 strings to large floor harps standing over 1 meter tall with numerous strings spanning a wide tonal range. The playing technique involved plucking strings with the fingers, while sometimes damping unwanted resonances with the palm. The larger harps required dedicated musicians with substantial training to perform complex musical compositions. Percussion instruments, including drums and tambourines, provided rhythmic accompaniment to melodic instruments and vocal performances. The drums consisted of hollow cylinders, or pots covered with stretched leather drumheads, that produced sounds when struck with hands or sticks. The size of drums varied from small hand drums measuring 20 centimeters in diameter to large ceremonial drums exceeding 1 meter across that produced deep resonant tones audible across great distances. The construction of good drumheads required careful selection and preparation of leather to achieve the proper thickness and elasticity that produced clear tones rather than dull thuds. Wind instruments, including flutes and reed pipes, offered additional melodic possibilities for ensemble performances. The flutes were constructed from hollow reeds or bones with finger holes that allowed players to vary pitch by covering or uncovering holes while blowing across an opening. The reed pipes used vibrating reeds similar to modern clarinets or oboes to create sound with finger holes enabling melodic variation. These instruments required skill to play in tune and coordinate with other ensemble members, but provided distinctive timbres that added variety to musical performances. The context for musical performance included religious ceremonies, where music accompanied sacrifices and ritual actions, royal banquets where musicians entertained elite guests, and public celebrations during festivals when entire communities gathered for collective celebrations. Professional musicians employed by temples and palaces performed regularly as part of their official duties, while amateur musicians played for personal enjoyment and informal gatherings. The transmission of musical knowledge occurred through apprenticeship, with younger musicians learning from experienced performers through observation and practice rather than written notation. Board games provided entertainment for those with sufficient leisure time and resources to engage in recreational activities. Archaeological discoveries of game boards and playing pieces reveal the popularity of these diversions among Uruk's elite population. The royal game of though named after discoveries at a different site, represents a game type that was popular throughout Mesopotamia during the early dynastic period. The game board consisted of a distinctive pattern of 20 squares arranged in a particular layout, with 2 players racing pieces from start to finish, according to moves determined by throwing marked dice or casting sticks. The playing pieces recovered from archaeological contexts include elaborately carved game pieces of ivory, bone, stone, and precious materials demonstrating the value placed on game equipment by wealthy owners. Some game sets found in elite tombs suggest that games were considered appropriate accompaniments to the afterlife, where the deceased could continue enjoying recreational activities. The rules of ancient games remain uncertain since no written instructions survive, but analysis of board layouts and the number of playing pieces combined with references in later texts provides basis for reconstructing probable playing methods. Dice and other randomizing devices enabled gambling and games of chance that offered excitement through uncertainty of outcomes. The earliest dice consisted of knuckle bones from sheep or goats with 4 distinct sides that landed in predictable orientations when thrown. Later examples used purpose-made dice of fired clay, stone, or ivory shaped into regular polyhedra with marked faces indicating numerical values. The use of dice in games introduced elements of luck that could reverse fortunes and create dramatic moments during play. The social functions of games and entertainment extended beyond simple diversion to include strengthening social bonds through shared activities, providing opportunities for social competition in non-violent contexts, and demonstrating wealth and status through possession of elaborate game equipment. The games also served educational functions, teaching strategic thinking, mathematical concepts through scoring systems, and social skills through interaction with other players. The integration of games into elite culture appears in artistic depictions and textual references that establish gaming as an acceptable and valued leisure activity for those with sufficient resources to pursue it. During the late 4th millennium BC, Uruk established colonies and trading outposts throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, spreading Sumerian culture, administrative techniques, and writing systems across the ancient Near East. Archaeological sites in Syria, southeastern Turkey, and southwestern Iran reveal Uruk-style architecture, administrative practices, and material culture indicating the city's extensive commercial and political influence during this period of expansion. The phenomenon known to archaeologists as the Uruk expansion represents one of the most significant episodes in ancient Near Eastern history, though the mechanisms and motivations behind it remain subjects of scholarly debate. During the period from approximately 3400 to 3100 BC, settlements displaying distinctively Uruk material culture appeared across a vast region extending over 1,500 kilometers from southern Mesopotamia through northern Mesopotamia and Syria into southeastern Anatolia. These sites exhibit Uruk-style pottery, architecture, administrative technologies, and economic organization in contexts suggesting direct settlement by populations originating from the Uruk region. The archaeological evidence for Uruk presence in distant regions includes complete settlement systems, rather than merely scattered trade goods. Sites like Habuba Kabira on the Euphrates River in Syria consisted of planned settlements with fortification walls, temple complexes, administrative buildings, and residential neighborhoods following organizational principles documented at Uruk itself. The pottery assemblages at these sites match southern Mesopotamian types, both in vessel forms and manufacturing techniques, including the mass-produced beveled rim bowls characteristic of Uruk institutional food distribution systems. The architectural layouts employed the distinctive tripartite temple plans and administrative building designs known from southern sites. The administrative technologies transferred to these colonies included the writing system whose earliest examples outside southern Mesopotamia appear at sites like Habuba Kabira and Tel Brak. The tablets from these sites employ the same pictographic signs and accounting procedures documented in Uruk for contexts demonstrating direct knowledge transfer rather than local adoption of foreign ideas. The cylinder seals used to mark ownership and authenticate transactions show iconographic styles and technical characteristics matching southern Mesopotamian examples. The integration of writing, sealing, and accounting procedures indicates transplantation of complete administrative systems rather than selective borrowing of useful technologies. The motivations driving Uruk expansion likely combined economic, political, and demographic factors that made foreign colonies attractive despite the costs and risks involved. The primary economic motivation involved securing access to essential raw materials unavailable in southern Mesopotamia, including timber, metal ores, and stone. The establishment of colonies in resource-rich regions enabled direct control over production and transport of these materials, while eliminating dependence on independent intermediaries who could disrupt supply or demand excessive compensation. The agricultural productivity of northern regions with reliable rainfall exceeded southern Mesopotamia's irrigation-dependent farming, making northern grain supplies valuable supplements to domestic production. The political motivations may have included competition between southern cities for control of trade routes and resources with successful establishment of northern colonies, enhancing the founding city's power and prestige. The colonies could serve as markets for southern manufactured goods, creating economic relationships that benefited both regions while generating revenues for organizing institutions. The ideological component may have involved spreading Sumerian culture and religious practices to regions perceived as requiring civilization, though this motivation appears less prominently in archaeological evidence than material economic factors. The demographic pressures from rapid population growth in southern cities may have created pressures for expansion, with colonies absorbing surplus population that could not be supported by available agricultural land. The establishment of new settlements in northern regions provided opportunities for ambitious individuals who could achieve higher status as colonial administrators or successful merchants than they could attain in the competitive environment of established southern cities. The colonial ventures offered possibilities for social advancement that attracted participants despite the risks of settling in foreign territories. The mechanisms of expansion remain debated, with proposed models ranging from military conquest to peaceful commercial colonization. The archaeological evidence suggests diverse situations in different regions, with some colonies appearing as isolated outposts surrounded by indigenous populations, while others represent substantial settlements that may have displaced or absorbed local inhabitants. The fortifications at sites like Habuba Kabira indicate concerns about security, suggesting tensions with local populations, while the apparent integration of southern and local material culture at some sites suggests more cooperative relationships. The collapse of the Uruk expansion around 3100 BC occurred relatively suddenly, with most colonies being abandoned and southern administrative systems disappearing from northern regions. The causes of this collapse remain uncertain, but may involve changes in political organization in southern Mesopotamia, resistance from local populations in northern regions, or disruptions to trade routes that made colonies economically unviable. The legacy of the expansion persisted through transmission of administrative technologies, architectural concepts, and economic practices that influenced subsequent northern Mesopotamian cultures. Uruk's position as Mesopotamia's preeminent city gradually declined during the 3rd millennium BC, as rival city-states including Kish, and Lagash competed for political dominance and control of trade routes. Despite losing its political supremacy, Uruk remained an important religious and cultural centre for thousands of years, with the city continuing to be inhabited until approximately 300 AD, when changing river courses and political upheavals finally led to its abandonment and transformation into the archaeological site excavated by modern scholars. The political fragmentation of Mesopotamia during the early dynastic period, from 2900 to 2300 BC, saw power dispersed among multiple competing city-states, rather than concentrated in a single dominant centre. Uruk continued as a significant city, but shared prominence with rivals who controlled comparable territories and resources. The competition between cities involved warfare, alliance formation, and commercial rivalry that periodically shifted the balance of power. The Sumerian king list records multiple dynasties ruling from different cities, with kingship passing between Uruk, Kish, and other centres, in a pattern suggesting chronic political instability. The rise of territorial states during the Akkadian period around 2300 BC and the subsequent Ur-III period from 2100 to 2000 BC temporarily unified Mesopotamia under centralized governments that reduced individual cities to administrative units within larger political structures. Uruk lost its independence, becoming subordinate to rulers based in Akkad, and later who appointed governors to manage the city on behalf of the central government. Despite this political subordination, Uruk retained significance as a religious centre, with its temples receiving royal patronage and maintaining important cult practices. The city's religious importance ensured continued habitation and periodic renewal of sacred architecture, even during periods of political decline. The Temple of Eanna remained a major pilgrimage destination, attracting worshippers from across Mesopotamia who sought the goddess's favour. The Eanna precinct continued receiving donations and endowments from wealthy individuals and royal patrons who funded construction projects and supported priestly establishments. The religious revenue sustained a permanent temple population and attracted associated economic activities, including craftspeople serving pilgrims and merchants supplying temple operations. The physical city contracted during the 2nd millennium BC as population declined, and areas that had been densely inhabited during the early dynastic period were abandoned or used for agriculture. Archaeological surveys reveal that the inhabited area shrank from the approximately 550 hectares occupied during Uruk's peak to perhaps 100 hectares during the Old Babylonian period. The reduction reflected broader patterns of urban decline and rural migration during periods of political instability, and environmental stress, including increased soil salinization that reduced agricultural productivity. Despite urban contraction, Uruk experienced periodic revivals during the first millennium BC, when the city benefited from political stability under the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. Royal patronage funded reconstruction of temples and administrative buildings, while population increased as security improved and economic opportunities expanded. The Greek historian Herodotus mentioned Uruk during the 5th century BC, noting its impressive walls and religious significance, though by that time the city represented only a shadow of its former glory. The Seleucid and Parthian periods from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD saw continued occupation with Greek and Persian cultural influences blending with traditional Mesopotamian practices. Temples continued operating, though, with reduced scale and resources, while residential neighbourhoods occupied only small portions of the ancient city's footprint. Cuneiform writing persisted at Uruk longer than at most Mesopotamian sites, with the latest dated cuneiform tablet from Uruk inscribed in 79 AD, demonstrating remarkable continuity of scribal traditions. The final abandonment of Uruk occurred during the early centuries AD, when multiple factors combined to make continued habitation unsustainable. Changes in Euphrates river courses diverted water away from the city's canal systems, eliminating reliable water supplies and irrigation capabilities. Political instability during the late Parthian and early Sasanian periods disrupted trade and reduced the resources available for maintaining urban infrastructure. The spread of Christianity reduced the importance of traditional Mesopotamian religious centers, as temples lost patronage and pilgrimage traffic declined. The accumulation of these pressures led to gradual population exodus until the city was completely abandoned. The abandoned city gradually disappeared beneath accumulating sand and wind-blown soil, with only the largest mounds marking the locations of major temple complexes. Local populations occasionally quarried the ruins for building materials, extracting fired bricks and stone elements for use in new constructions. The site became known as al-Warka in Arabic, preserving a corrupted form of the ancient name Uruk, European. Travellers during the 19th century identified the mounds as ancient ruins, but their significance remained unrecognised until systematic excavations began in the early 20th century. The archaeological investigation of Uruk, initiated by the German Oriental Society in 1913, transformed understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization. The excavations revealed the scale and sophistication of the world's first city, demonstrating that urban civilization emerged thousands of years earlier than previously recognized. The discoveries of the earliest writing, monumental architecture, and complex administrative systems established Uruk as a crucial site for understanding human social evolution. The ongoing excavations and analysis of recovered materials continue providing insights into the origins of urban civilization and the daily lives of humanity's first city dwellers, whose innovations shaped the trajectory of human history. The archaeological evidence recovered from Uruk across more than a century of systematic excavation reveals the extraordinary achievement of humanity's first experiment in urban living. Around 3200 BC, in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, human societies crossed a threshold that fundamentally transformed the trajectory of civilization. The transition from scattered agricultural villages to a densely populated metropolis housing 50,000 inhabitants required revolutionary innovations in technology, social organization, and conceptual frameworks for understanding human relationships and social obligations. The invention of writing emerged not from abstract intellectual curiosity, but from the practical necessity of managing complex institutional economies involving thousands of workers, vast agricultural estates, and extensive manufacturing operations. The earliest cuneiform tablets document the mundane details of grain receipts, livestock counts, and worker rations. Yet these prosaic records represent one of humanity's most significant intellectual achievements. Writing enabled the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations, creating institutional memory that could survive individual lifetimes and preserve technical expertise, legal precedents, and cultural traditions. The administrative systems developed to manage Uruk's temple economies established organizational principles and accounting techniques that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years. The architectural innovations visible in Uruk's monumental temple complexes demonstrates sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, materials science, and labour organisation. The construction of massive platforms supporting temples like the White Temple required mobilising workforces numbering in the thousands, coordinating the production of millions of bricks, and executing construction projects extending across multiple years or decades. These achievements reflect not merely technical capabilities, but also the development of hierarchical authority structures capable of extracting surplus production from agricultural populations and directing those resources toward collective projects that served religious, political, and economic functions simultaneously. The economic specialization enabled by urban concentration created unprecedented diversity in occupational roles, with dedicated craftspeople producing pottery, textiles, metal goods, and other manufactures at scales impossible in village economies. The standardization of production through workshop manufacturing and the development of long-distance trade networks connecting Mesopotamia with resource regions across 3 continents established economic patterns that would persist throughout ancient history. The temple redistributive systems that collected agricultural surplus and distributed rations to workers created institutional mechanisms for managing economic inequality, while ensuring subsistence security for urban populations dependent on food production by others. The social hierarchies evident in differential housing quality, burial practices, and access to luxury goods reveal the emergence of class-based societies fundamentally different from the more egalitarian village communities that preceded urban civilization. The concentration of wealth and power in elite families who controlled temple and palace institutions, the development of dependent labour systems that bound workers to institutional employers, and the existence of slavery demonstrate that urban civilization brought not only technological advancement and cultural achievement, but also institutionalized inequality and exploitation. The legal systems developed to manage disputes and enforce contracts reflect attempts to regulate social relationships in complex urban environments, where traditional kinship-based mechanisms for conflict resolution proved inadequate. The legacy of Uruk extends far beyond the physical ruins scattered across the Iraqi desert. The innovations pioneered in this first city established templates for urban organization, administrative practice, and cultural expression that influenced subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations, and ultimately shaped the development of Western civilization. The cuneiform writing system evolved into the medium for recording humanity's earliest literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, legal codes, scientific treatises, and historical chronicles. The architectural principles developed in Uruk's temples influenced monumental construction throughout the ancient Near East. The economic and administrative techniques refined in temple workshops provided models for managing complex institutions across millennia. Understanding Uruk's achievement requires recognizing both the extraordinary capabilities demonstrated by these early urban dwellers and the tremendous challenges they faced in creating sustainable systems for organizing human societies at unprecedented scales. Their successes and failures offer insights relevant to contemporary urban civilizations, grappling with similar challenges of resource management, social inequality, environmental sustainability, and the preservation of cultural knowledge across generational transitions. The story of Uruk reminds us that urban civilization represents not an inevitable evolutionary endpoint, but a continuous experiment requiring constant adaptation and innovation to address the recurring challenges of organizing complex human societies.